Hello, welcome to the debate on Sky News. I'm Martin Stanford. Here's our take on developments brought together from America, the UK and around the world. The battle of Zika, yes, it's spreading. It's already in America. How deadly is this virus? Plus, Iowa done, next stop New Hampshire.
I come in second. I'm not humiliated.
And determine who's telling the truth and who's blowing smoke.
Stand up for me, fight for me, and when we win, I will stand up and fight for you.
A global emergency or a global health scare leading to global panic. Is the Zika virus worse than Ebola? In a moment, we'll speak to Professor Jack Chow, who's a former Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Health and Science. As usual, though, the Democrat commentator, Jeffrey Robinson, is standing by for us in New York, and Conservative commentator Armstrong Williams is in Washington. Jeffrey, what's the mature response to this? Should we be scared?
Yes, absolutely. We have known about this for, I think, since 1946. I'm not sure why something hasn't been done about it sooner. What worries me about these kinds of things is that they appear to be happening at a greater frequency. SARS, Ebola, this, and the other ones in between. I just don't understand, and I'm saddened by the fact that we don't get a global response to this until these particular viruses go into the rich, white, developed world. Why was 1946 is time enough to have done something about this, but it's only now that people are panicking. And within a year or two, the pharmaceutical industry hopefully will come up with a vaccine. But that's because it affects white, rich, developed nation population. Sad.
Armstrong, do you think the CDC in the States has done the right thing?
Listen, the first thing you have to understand is that about this virus, initially they felt that it was transmitted through animals, especially mosquitoes. And there are times when people thought that it was actually transmitted sexually, where it could be stored in a person's semen, and just how long it would be in a semen. And so it was not until recently that when someone, I think somewhere in South America, contracted it, and they made a connection with someone here in the United States, and the person in the United States had not traveled outside of those areas, they realized that the virus is not as sexually transmitted. That makes it very dangerous. Even though they say the best thing you can do is either abstinence or use a condom, that gives a whole new concern to the virus. So I think through education, through understanding, making sure that people are tested, that you can sort of get this under control. It's not something to panic about or whip the world into a frenzy. It's an issue. We know what causes it, and we also know how to maintain it if we follow certain procedures and precautions going forward.
Let's speak to Jack Chow, Professor of Public Health, a former Assistant Director General of the World Health Organization, and Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Health and Science. Professor Chow, there is a worry here that this is being overstated, that it's alarmist.
Well, it is a new threat to global health security. At present, it may not be a quantitative threat on the level of HIV/AIDS or the recent Ebola outbreak. Where it is a threat to global health security is it presses the psychological fears of parents who are now stricken by this virus and could deliver a baby with severe brain and skull malformation. This fear is reminiscent of the thalidomide crisis way back in the 1960s. So what is clear it is a threat to the psychological security of countries. And WHO's emergency call to action ought to be a catalyst for a new global campaign to defeat this virus.
Because when we were dealing with Ebola, we had a conversation on this programme and others about that need for global coordination and how maybe some of the systems aren't really working very well. What's your take on what's happened in the last couple of weeks?
Well, it's clear that we really need to invest in the global health institutions like the World Health Organization and the Pan American Health Organization. And more importantly, we need to build a global health network that knits together the private sector with the public health authorities and create a ringnet of surveillance and immediate mobilization when situations like this occur. I had advocated for a new international medical NATO, that can act as a ready response to these kinds of crises. And that has yet to be created. And again, it shows that a disease knows no boundaries and it knows no time limits. And we have to invest in a first response capability.
Let's bring in Jeffrey and Armstrong on this point. Jeffrey, a medical NATO, I think we've had this conversation before, but it ends up with who ends up paying for it, doesn't it?
Well, that's the sad point, that of course it does. It's a very good idea, however, because I think these things are necessary. As the professor said, these diseases know no boundaries. I'm curious, though, because it appears to be mosquito-borne and sexually transmitted. There's a story out this week that some people are advocating the global mass extinction of mosquitoes. Now, I have no idea where they fit into the ecological chain, but I suspect the professor does. I don't know if it's practical, but given the fact that there are so many of these diseases transmitted by mosquitoes, Professor, is it a good idea to start thinking about the global extinction of the mosquito?
In fact, there is a British company, a biotech company called Oxitec. And Oxitec has created genetically modified mosquitoes, male mosquitoes that don't bite people. And they have inserted a gene that when these male mosquitoes are released and mate with in the wild with the female mosquitoes, the eggs become non-viable. And Oxitec is actually working in Brazil with permission of the Brazilian government. And so far, the results have been encouraging, that they've seen up to an 80 to 90% reduction in the presence of the Aedes aegypti mosquito. So going forward, I think this is a very promising technology. If this technology can be scaled up throughout Brazil and throughout other countries safely, I think it would be a potent weapon against the propagation of one of the most deadliest mosquitoes.
Armstrong, the problem, I suppose, for many countries is they've got an emergency like this, which would be on a global area of concern. You could understand governments, particularly ones sensitive to maybe visitors coming in and the holiday industry, being reluctant to admit to it.
You know, you don't want to bring about panic. It does have an impact on tourism and people coming to the country. You know, it's curious whether or not, and I can't recall whether this is the case or not, whether any mosquito bites had led to someone contracting the virus in the United States. It seems to be that this virus is contracted in areas where there's a lot of poverty, and the water system is just the worst. And you know, mosquitoes breathe and thrive in situations where you have that water supply that's highly contaminated. You know, I think we have a pretty good enough knowledge about this virus that we have enough scientists and people with common sense in the world that you can sort of maintain it and sort of reduce it and making sure that it doesn't spread. One of the things that people really have to think about are their sexual partners, especially people coming from different regions of the world where that could be very possible, because even you have spouses who work in these environments, and when they come home, they have sexual encounters with their wives, and they wake up, they have these lymph nodes, they have this flu-like disease, they have this fever. And so even married couples, we're not just talking about single couples, even married couples must be very cautious about it, especially if their spouse if they're returning from this part of the world. They've got to find a way to sort of go to the doctor and make sure they're checked out, to make sure they get a clean bill of health before they engage in these sexual encounters with their wives or someone they care about.
Professor Chow, what's the public information? Well, we've heard about it, of course, as Jeffrey was alluding to. I suppose in the West, we're fairly well off. We've got good communications. Is there enough effort going into the public communications to take these precautions in the areas where people need to behave in this way?
Well, clearly, the global and national and local communications ought to be built out robustly and very soon, because information needs to get down to the community level from the scientific authorities and communicated accurately. That's why a global coordinator led by the WHO and the Pan American Health Organization would be very useful, to have a focal point of contact who can collect this information, who can make the mobilization, and then can share that information to people and patients.
But who's going to fund that guy, Jeffrey? I come back to my question about money. America really should take the lead, shouldn't it?
Well, America can afford to take the lead, so can the rest of the West. But as long as it doesn't actually affect people in the rich, developed world, it's a political problem as to why should we pay for it. There is a serious economic aspect to this, especially in the epicenter of Brazil, with the Summer Olympics coming up in Brazil.
Yeah.
They need to get this under control rather quickly before people start having doubts as to whether or not they want to risk it by coming to Brazil for the Olympics.
Carnival too. I was talking about the tourism industry, Armstrong. I mean, Carnival's coming up. Will people want to travel down there to Carnival with this going on?
I got to tell you, Martin, if you think that it's not a crisis yet, I mean, when you're in a place like a jungle and it's scorching heat and that kind of weather, that's where mosquitoes really come out. So look, I think the money will not be the issue. I think the United States has shown that it has always led the way in fighting these crises to make sure we save human life and sort of stabilize this matter. I think that it will always be the case for the United States and other first world countries. But listen, these governments must do their part to make sure they do everything they can to put all the measures in place to prevent innocent people from being in an environment where a virus like this thrives.
Professor Chow, just explain what you would understand how the progress of this. I mean, we're hearing that Peru is the latest country, as we record this discussion, to be affected. There may well be others in. Would you expect it to spread and spread further?
Yeah, the two chief ingredients for this spread is the presence of the Aedes aegypti mosquito and the body of the collective reservoir, or the population that currently have the infection. And WHO is expecting that the numbers of people who hold the virus will grow to about 4 million. The Aedes aegypti in the Americas is pretty widespread from Brazil, and it also includes the southeast portion of the United States. So this mosquito resides between Florida and Texas. So it is very imperative that we have a comprehensive strategy, a battle plan against the mosquito, and find ways to prevent people from acquiring the virus from bites. Regarding funding, there are three specific ideas that I think ought to be put on the table. One is that the World Bank, during the Ebola crisis, released emergency funds to those three African countries. The World Bank could now ought to be pivoting funds to the Americas for Zika control. Second, there is a global fund to fight AIDS, TB, and malaria. That malaria component is very much anti-mosquito. Countries could donate funds to the global fund, which in turn can help these countries in the Americas. And third, the United States, when we mention the United States has a special program called the Presidential Malaria Initiative, and it works with countries to on mosquito control efforts. So there's at least three financial institutions dedicated to health that we could mobilize resources in short order.
Professor Jack Chow, thank you for being with us today. A reminder, you can catch up with the Sky News debate on Apple TV, Roku and Catch Up. And of course on skynews.com/US. Now, there were surprises in both camps at Iowa. Trump slumped and Bernie bounced. What then for New Hampshire? More musical chairs? Any more surprises? In Washington is Carmel Martin, the Executive Vice President for Policy at the Center for American Progress. She was also an advisor to Hillary Clinton and a former Assistant Secretary of Education. Carmel Martin, I guess you're going to tell me Hillary Clinton will do well.
I believe that she will do well. I think it's a good thing that there is a real competition on the Democratic side in terms of the primary. I think the positive aspect of the Democratic primary is it's really focused on ideas, and what both candidates are focused on are the ideas that American people are really focused on: how to make college more affordable, how to deal with stagnant wages, how to ensure that all Americans have access to paid leave. I think both candidates are making the other candidate sharper, both in terms of their ideas and their message. And I think in stark contrast, you have a Republican primary where instead of being focused on ideas, they're focused on personal attacks, and they're focused on issues that aren't really responsive to the needs of the American people. So I think big picture coming out of Iowa, I think the Democratic candidates are in a much more positive position than on the Democratic side.
Carmel Martin, forgive me. Let me interrupt you at that point. I cannot believe it's as simple as that. Hillary Clinton would not have her winning the first caucus, the first battle of this campaign, on the toss of a coin. She cannot have enjoyed that, surely.
Well, I'm sure each of the candidates would like to win by a wide margin. But I think at the end of the day, she did win. I think she is very well positioned. The primary is not going to be decided based on just one or two states. And I think if you look at the primary over the long term, she's very well positioned to succeed. I think Bernie Sanders has been a very strong candidate, and I think that there's positive aspects to that. At the end of the day, I think Hillary Clinton is likely to be the nominee. I think to be the nominee on the Democratic side, you need to appeal to a broad coalition of voters. I think she has a lot of strengths in that regard. I also think, as the president noted recently, it's hard to argue that she isn't the best qualified person from any of the political parties, best qualified person to do the job. I think that's going to make a big difference to a lot of voters. But obviously, the race isn't over. She's going to have to work hard for it. But I think it's going to be a positive thing for democracy that there's a real fight there. And I think at the end of the day, I think the Democrats will be well positioned because their fight, their debate is so grounded in issues that matter to American people.
Well, let's bring in Jeffrey and Armstrong, who's standing by in Washington. Armstrong, we'll do the Republicans in a minute. What do you make of this Democrat dead heat, though, in Iowa? Do we read too much into that?
Listen, Mrs. Clinton may be the brightest and most experienced candidate of all the candidates on both sides, but she is the least trusted, and she's unpopular. People feel she's unethical. And anybody who believes that you can tell the American people that someone flipped the coin 6 times, if that is true, and that Mrs. Clinton won every time, I'll show you a dog in your studio running around pooping, okay? That is outrageous. That race was taken from Bernie Sanders. They should win it fair and square. She stood up in her arrogance and said, I claim victory like some czar, and it just builds more sympathy for Bernie Sanders. It doesn't help her in the long run. She'll win at all costs. There's no humility in terms of her conceding the fact that Bernie Sanders has captured the imagination of young people and many voters because they just don't trust she and her husband's brand. And until she learns the lessons from the last campaign, it's going to be bruising. And it's going to be very shocking that she could possibly lose to Bernie Sanders going forward, because she's definitely will lose to him in New Hampshire in less than a week away.
Jeffrey, she is going to lose in New Hampshire, isn't she?
Yes, probably. But it's a question of by how much. Now, I want the audience to consider the source of the previous remarks by Armstrong. Armstrong is a guy who thinks Ben Carson is the most qualified person in America to be president. That should explain everything about Armstrong and his views. Let me say this. The Iowa caucus is a completely screwy system. I mean, it's completely wacko. There are other caucuses, and there's a way to play the caucus game. Ted Cruz understood it. Bernie understood it. Marco Rubio understood it. Donald Trump did not. There's the Nevada coming up pretty soon. That's also a caucus. But New Hampshire's an election. We go to Georgia, where Hillary's got a big firewall against Bernie. And this will now start changing. What worries me is, where do the votes go from the Republican clown car once people start dropping out? We heard this week that Rand Paul has now dropped out. Mike Huckabee dropped out the other night. Rick Santorum will drop out pretty soon. Carly Fiorina will drop out pretty soon. It will leave Kasich, Bush, and Christie to fight Rubio. And in the next couple of 3 weeks, Ben Carson is history as well. Where do those votes go? I suspect after the disgusting tactics of Ted Cruz this week in Iowa vis-a-vis Ben Carson, that Carson's votes may very well be channeled by him back to Donald Trump, who's been very nice to him. I mean, Cruz committed huge sins, perhaps even illegalities in the way he handled Iowa. Rubio, well, let me just say, Rubio finished third. He got up and he proclaimed victory. He finished third. He lost. But what's going to happen in New Hampshire is he needs to have a strong second finish to Donald Trump, who probably will win it. If Rubio finishes a strong second, he becomes a much more viable candidate. If he doesn't, then he's history as well, because the others are going to gang up on him and end his career.
Well, let's ask Carmel Martin, shall we, who's our special guest in this segment, about the Trump phenomenon. Two thoughts come to mind. Was it a mistake to boycott that final TV debate? And does it matter that he lost?
I think it matters a great deal that he lost. I think that it's taken a lot of momentum away from his campaign. I think in the long run, he's going to continue to lose that momentum because I think at the end of the day, people will recognize that he's not laying out clear ideas for what he would do as president. He's really focused on being a showman, being someone who says outrageous things to get attention. I think he's alienating big swaths of voters. So, I think as the race moves on, he's going to continue to lose support. That said, I think he's definitely going to continue to be a factor on the Republican side, and I think it makes it difficult for the Republicans because he's pushing them to extreme positions on issues like immigration, which is going to alienate the party further from the Hispanic population in the United States, and he's preventing them from being focused on the issues that people care about and want to hear about from their future president. So I think it remains to be seen what will happen, but I do think his where he landed in Iowa is very significant.
Sure. Let me bring in Armstrong again at this point. Armstrong, notwithstanding you are the business manager of Ben Carson, let me ask you about Marco Rubio. He's looking like a good bet, isn't he, to come through the middle of all this?
It depends on who's looking. I guess if you're looking, he's looking like a good bet. I mean, people can look like a good bet until they're challenged. He's on the assault now by Cruz and Trump. Obviously, he did well in Iowa. Some of it had to do with, as Jeffrey talked about, Cruz's unethical, dirty politics, sleazy, just unimaginable, who calls himself a Christian, and what he resorted to is just absolutely outrageous. But, Rubio will see if he can stand the challenge. Bush is doing well in New Hampshire. He has a shot at it. Listen, this presidential cycle has shown both on the Republican and Democratic side, no one is assured of front-runner status except maybe Donald Trump. No one expected him to win Iowa. I think it's an outrage to make it seem as though Trump is slumping. I mean, listen, he did well to even place in second place. Donald Trump will win New Hampshire, and he should go on and do well in the other primaries that are ahead of him. But in terms of Rubio and Cruz, they still have much to prove. They have not solidified themselves with the GOP voters as of this date.
Jeffrey, I think I know the answer to this because you've said it many times before, but I'm going to ask it anyway. The Trump bubble, has it burst for you?
No, not at all. It's funny because I politically agree wholeheartedly with Carmel and usually disagree with Armstrong. This time I've got to switch positions because I think she's wrong and he's very right. What Cruz did in Iowa was absolutely downright disgusting, and he's going to be found out to be a cheat. I also maintain the fact that he is ineligible to run. And that movement, by the way, is progressing. That's growing. There are more and more people who are now saying, we don't think he is eligible to run. Rubio is a lightweight. He's running for prom chairman of his high school. He really is a total lightweight, and he will be found out. Donald Trump has learned his lesson in Iowa. He did not mount the ground game that he should have, and he's not going to make that mistake again. He will, I'm sure, win in New Hampshire. If he doesn't, he's finished, but I'm sure he will. He'll go to Nevada and he'll mount a ground game there. Don't forget, he's been in the gaming industry, and they will like him in Nevada. He will win in South Carolina. I suspect that he will gain enough momentum to beat Bush and Rubio combined in Florida. Then we get to the Super Tuesday states, and he may very well be able to sew it up because he's got the money, and he's bringing in the endorsements. He's bringing in the people to back him. Rubio, by the way, doesn't have a single endorsement from his own Senate. They don't like him any more than they like Cruz. Hillary, she's got a battle on her hands, but there's something, and Carmel can explain it better than I can. There's something called superdelegates, and Hillary's got a whole whack of those people. So even if Bernie does make some inroads into the delegate count, she's starting way ahead of him because of those superdelegates. Well, look for a Trump-Hillary November election.
Okay, Carmel, let me ask you about that Bernie Sanders phenomenon which you alluded to, and in particular, if it isn't to be him, and it does go to Hillary Clinton, where does all those young people, which he's been particularly successful, the post-students, early 20s, where are they going to go if Bernie Sanders isn't there?
I think at the end of the day, they will support Hillary Clinton. I think Bernie Sanders undoubtedly has an advantage among that demographic group at the moment. But I think as she continues, her track record and her policy agenda is very responsive to the things that young people care about, young progressives care about. So I think they will support her. And I think as the primary season moves forward, you'll see them gaining more and more percentage of that support. And if she's the ultimate nominee, I believe strongly that they'll support her. Just one comment. I didn't mean to imply earlier that I didn't think that Trump was out based on Iowa. I just think Iowa was a bad result for him, given the expectations and the momentum he had going into it. I don't disagree that there's a possibility that he'll be the nominee on the Republican side, but I think that's a bad thing for Republicans. And 50% of Americans said they would be embarrassed to have Trump as their president. I think that's a tough candidate to go into the general election with.
Carmel Martin, great to have you with us today. Thank you both very much. Thanks, Jeffrey. Thanks, Armstrong. And that's it for this edition of The Debate. You can continue watching Sky News on Roku, on Apple TV, and on Catch Up, and of course at skynews.com. Until next time, goodbye.